this is Jordan Saville, and today we will be looking at distortion and its use in guitar music. Before we begin, I want you to pay attention to this graph in the top left, which shows you how signal moves between thresholds. Distortion in its earliest stages is known as clipping, and clipping is to take the tops and bottoms off of the signal and to squish it within its threshold. They refer to that as clipping. Soft clipping can be seen here, where it's cutting off the tops but isn't too changing in terms of distortion, but hard clipping down here is a transformative sound and will begin to take away from quality in some people's eyes. But we will come on to that later. What is distortion? Once again, it's a form of audio processing used to change the sound of electronic instruments to produce a grittier sound. Been used on instruments such as guitars, electric pianos, and other instruments. It affects the sound by clipping the signal, which is to push it past its maximum, which cuts off the tops and bottoms of the signal wave. This adds sustain and more pronounced overtones and harmonics and produces a more compressed, dirtier sound. History and early usage. The first form of distortions were found by mistake from slightly broken amps or amps that were cranked so high that they'd begin to distort their own signal. Originally used in early blues, which favoured the low and dirty tones, it was used to try and match the raw forms of blues singing that was also starting to emerge at the time. Evolved with guitar pickups, specifically the humbucker, such as pickups from Junior Bernard. The reason why humbuckers were popular with distortion is because most guitars at the time used single coils, such as Fender, and those pickups were very infamous for creating a lot of feedback noise when using a lot of distortion. People would go on to use humbuckers because it would produce far less feedback between notes and generally handle distortion a lot better. Before the rollout of commercial pedals, artists started to abuse amps intentionally to get their overdrive and distortion sound, such as Link Wray and Dave Davies of the Kings, who would take a razor blade to the speaker cone of his guitar amp in order to get that overdriven sound. The first form of commercial distortion pedals was a fuzz pedal called the Maestro FZ1 Fuzz Tone, which was used on the song I Can't Get No Satisfaction. We will get onto fuzz later. Heavy metal was founded by combining both the uses of distortion, high volume, and dissonance, as well as other more harmonic features. Overdrive and distortion can be used interchangeably. They are different forms of distortion natively. Overdrive is the cleaner side, and distortion is the more extreme side. They can be used interchangeably within a signal as well. Overdrive can be used to boost a signal, or used solely just to get a more pop-punky guitar tone, or distortion can be used solely by itself, or in combination, using overdrive to boost a distortion signal. Overdrive is generally used in rock, blues, and some hard rock. It's generally the lighter side of distortion, more akin to, say, the Beatles than Metallica. Distortion is what really started to define metal. Think of bands such as Iron Maiden, Black Sabbath, Metallica. They are the people who started to really push the forefronts of distortion in the late 70s and early 80s. Fuzz is used in hard rock, punk, and metal, typically on bass guitars. It's used for a more buzzy sound and can be seen as a bit more lo-fi, and retains more sub than a distortion, because distortion takes a lot of sub out of the bass signal, which stops it from cutting through in very mids-heavy guitar mixes. Speaker cone damage is another way to get distortion, but it's not as reliable, and you are actually damaging your equipment. Tube amp distortion is different, but in the sense that it can be used in order to hold everything together. Tube amp is actually within the amp, and you can get pedals to assist it. Once again, you can use forms of distortion interchangeably. Finally, a more important topic is distortion emulation, such as combo amps and modeling amps. These are modeling amps, that access a database that allow you to download different guitar tones that have been modeled specifically to sound like different guitars or different amps in their combinations. Combo amps are miniature computers found within a guitar amp that allows you to switch between tones quite quickly, etc., etc. Distortion in rock and metal. Distortion helped to birth rock, metal, and other guitar genres, used mostly in rock and metal. Distortion is a defining staple across all forms of metal music. The various forms of distortion, overdrive, distortion, fuzz, vary in use and timbre from genre to genre, which is what helps to differentiate them. Great emphasis is put on guitar tone in metal music, and bass tends to stay cleaner in tone in most distorted forms of guitar music, as that retains the sub that allows it to cut through a mix. An example of the different emphases on distortion would be softer genres would use less distortion, and typically heavier genres would use more, i.e. death metal would have very high use of distortion, whereas generally you'd only really use an overdrive pedal for most punkier sounding guitar tones. I will now play a brief video going through the different kinds of metal genres and genres that use distortion in guitar music, and then I will discuss some of them at the end. So before we continue, I want you to pay attention to that song there. That song is called Misery Business. That song is a good example of the overlay between distortion and overdrive, where it starts to get a bit more extreme. You can hear it in the very modern sounding production. And punk generally uses less distortion, but still sounds a little bit more ragged and a bit more DIY. So this sound is most typical of distortion. It's the kind of sound you think of when you think of generic metal. It's distorted, but it's still fairly clear, as it's on a 6-string guitar. In the evolution of metal, they would choose lower tunings, and that would make it a lot harder to get a lot of definition in your guitar tones. All of these similar genres around a similar time period of the mid-80s to late 90s have similar guitar tones, because a lot of the same amps were used between groups such as Mesa and other guitar amps. Notice how they are similar. Also pay attention to how strong guitars are in the mix of most metal songs. Black metal is particularly interesting because they use distortion, but in combination with low quality recordings in order to get a very hissy, lo-fi and very tense soundscape. Finally, as we approach the more modern genres of music in metal community, such as metalcore and deathcore, which are respective metal genres influenced by hardcore, these genres tend to use drop tunings and distortion very, very often. This particular song is in drop C sharp, so they would operate in C sharp minor. However, the reason why this is important is because all of the production from here and out would become very compressed and very clean, as people wanted very tight, chuggy guitar tones. and thus ends my presentation.